The first thing Executor Vroth noticed was the silence on the tactical channel. Not static, not interference. Silence, the specific, surgical kind that meant someone had removed a frequency rather than lost it. He stood at the center of the Undying Throne's command ring, surrounded by 47 of the most sophisticated sensor arrays in the Keth Dominion's arsenal, and stared at a readout that showed him something his instruments had no category for. The human ships were inside the formation. Not approaching, not breaching, inside, already there. As if they had always been there and the Dominion fleet had simply failed to notice until now. Vroth pressed one finger against the glass of the display, tracing the 14 contacts scattered through the heart of his encirclement like seeds pressed into soil, and said nothing for a very long time. Behind him, Subcommander Isek cleared her throat. "Executor, the formation integrity reports." "I can read." "Should I signal the encirclement wings too?" "No." The contacts didn't move. They held position with a patience that Vroth found, against his professional judgment, deeply unsettling. His fleet had surrounded the third planet of this unremarkable system 17 days ago. They had mapped every gravitational lane, every debris field, every possible approach vector. The humans had no stealth technology capable of penetrating a full Keth encirclement. Every model, every simulation, every tactical doctrine said so. And yet, he made himself breathe slowly, the way his instructors had taught him when he was young and afraid of things he could not name. He thought about what he knew. He thought about what he didn't know. And somewhere in the space between those two things, a question formed that he would spend the next 31 days trying to answer. What else had he already failed to see? 12 days before the encirclement completed, a woman named Sergeant Yale Davin was lying face down in 8 inches of water inside a flooded maintenance tunnel beneath the city of Ankara, listening to the sound of the world ending above her. The sound was not dramatic. It never was in her experience. It was administrative. The low, rhythmic pressure pulse of Keth atmospheric processors cycling through their survey rotation, mapping every square kilometer of the surface in methodical 20-minute intervals. Each pulse passed through walls, through soil, through bone. You didn't hear it so much as feel it in the back of your teeth, a reminder that something very large and very thorough was looking for you. She had been in the tunnel for 11 hours. Her radio was off, had been off since hour 3, when the Keth survey drone had passed close enough that even low-power emissions carried risk. She communicated through a system that used pressure taps on copper piping, a language she had spent 4 months learning, and which the Keth had, as far as anyone could tell, never imagined existed. 3 taps paused, 2 taps. Still here. 2 taps from somewhere ahead in the darkness. Then one more, slow and deliberate. Understood, wait. Yale pressed her forehead against the cold metal of the tunnel floor and waited. Outside, above her, through meters of concrete and soil and the accumulated weight of a city holding its breath, the Keth were completing their encirclement of Earth. She knew this not because she had access to strategic feeds, but because the pressure pulse pattern had changed 6 hours ago. Slower, more confident. The pattern of a predator that has stopped searching and started watching. They thought they had everything contained. She almost smiled. Not because the situation was good. It wasn't. She had lost contact with her entire unit 3 days ago, had no idea whether Ankara's underground network was still intact, was running on 4 hours of sleep and a protein bar she'd split with someone she hadn't seen since. She smiled because of the thing she knew, and the thing the Keth didn't know she knew, and the specific distance between those two facts. The distance was everything. 3 taps, pause, 1. Move now. She moved. In the records of the Keth Dominion's encirclement of Saul, a document that would later be reclassified, then reclassified again, then buried in an archive accessible only to officers of sufficient rank and sufficient psychological certification. The first anomaly is logged at hour 412 of the operation. A maintenance worker on the Undying Throne noticed that the food processing unit in Sublevel 9 was consuming 7% more power than its operating specifications allowed. This was reported, as regulations required, to the ship's efficiency officer. The efficiency officer noted the discrepancy, ran a diagnostic, found nothing wrong with the unit itself, and filed the report. No one noticed that the 7% excess consumption had been exactly 7% for 11 straight days, not 6.8, not 7.2, exactly 7, every day, through 3 different diagnostic cycles. The maintenance worker's name was Preth. She was not an analyst. She was not a strategist. She was 19 years old and she filed her report and went back to work. And that was the last time anyone in the Keth command structure would have an opportunity to understand what was happening before it was too late. The second anomaly occurred 2 days later, when a sensor operator named Voss detected a gravitational microsignature that didn't match any cataloged object in the region. It was small, barely distinguishable from background stellar noise. It lasted 4 seconds, then vanished. Voss logged it as an instrument artifact and continued his shift. It happened again 6 hours later, different location. Then again, different again. Voss didn't connect them. Why would he? They were in different sectors of his sensor sweep, different magnitudes, different durations. Individually, each one meant nothing. Together, they described something that had no name in Keth tactical doctrine. The third anomaly was the one Executor Vroth was staring at now. 14 human ships, inside his encirclement, motionless, silent, not attacking, not fleeing, not transmitting on any detectable frequency. Just there. "Get me Doctrine Officer Mahan," Vroth said. Isek was already moving. Vroth kept his eyes on the display. The 14 contacts remained stable. They weren't cloaked. If they were cloaked, the sensors wouldn't show them at all. They were simply there, visible, making no attempt to hide, making no attempt to communicate, doing absolutely nothing that his training had prepared him to understand. Mahan arrived in 4 minutes. He was older than Vroth, with the particular kind of stillness that came from having read too many accounts of things going wrong in ways that seemed impossible beforehand. "Tell me what I'm seeing," Vroth said, and pointed at the display. Mahan looked at it for a long time. Then he said something that Vroth would remember for the rest of his life. "I can tell you what the instruments say. I cannot tell you what it means." "Then tell me what the instruments say." "They say the ships have been there for approximately 72 hours. Vroth turned to look at him. "We've been running continuous sensor sweeps." "Yes." "Full spectrum, every 12 minutes. "Yes." "And they've been asterisked there for 72 hours. "That appears to be correct." The word "appeared" did a lot of work in that sentence. Vroth noticed it. He filed it, the way he'd learned to file things that didn't yet have context, not dismissed, not acted on, just held carefully in a place where he could find it later. "They're not hiding," he said. "They're waiting." "That would be my reading." "Waiting for what?" Mahan looked at the display again. He had the expression of someone doing arithmetic in their head and not liking the answer. "I don't know, but Executor," he paused. "Say it." 72 hours ago, we completed the final arc of the encirclement. The room was quiet. "They moved into position," Vroth said slowly, "when we finished surrounding them." "Yes." "Why?" Mahan didn't answer, because there was no answer that fit cleanly into anything the Keth knew about how wars were supposed to work. And that, Vroth was beginning to understand, might be the entire point. Yale surfaced in a basement that smelled of old motor oil and damp concrete, and found 43 people she had never met, arranged in the darkness with the practiced stillness of people who had been hiding for a very long time. No one spoke. A woman with a scar across her left cheekbone pointed to the far corner of the room. Yale moved to it, lowered herself onto a crate, and a man she would come to know as Operative Samir pressed a laminated sheet into her hands. She read it in the blue light of a low-power chemical torch. She read it twice to make sure she had the numbers right. "This is global," she whispered. Samir nodded. "All 14. He held up a finger, then touched the paper, pointing to a line near the bottom. 14 confirmed insertion points, 18 total assets in position. Synchronization window opens in 90 hours. Yale sat with that for a moment. 18 ships, scattered through the heart of the most powerful military formation the Keth Dominion had ever assembled. Not to fight, the tonnage math made that a joke. 18 light ships against a Keth encirclement fleet was not a battle, it was a gesture, a statement. But the statement wasn't what she'd been told it was in the first briefings 6 months ago, when this whole thing was still theoretical. She understood that now. She understood what the ships were actually asterisk for. And she understood why no one had told her until now. In this basement, 43 people and a laminated sheet of paper. Because the kind of thing she was looking at was the kind of thing that didn't survive being known too early. She looked at Samir. Does the encirclement commander know what he's actually looking at? Samir's expression, even in the dim light, gave her a clear answer. No, he didn't. He thought he was looking at a desperate last gesture. He had no idea he was looking at the key. Here is the thing about a trap. It only works if the target doesn't know it is *1. And the more sophisticated the target, the more carefully the trap has to be hidden, not hidden from sight, but hidden from asterisk interpretation. Because a sophisticated enemy doesn't fail to see things. They fail to assign the right meaning to things they see clearly. The Keth Dominion had been encircling civilizations for 400 years. In that time, they had developed, refined, and institutionalized a complete doctrine of how encirclements worked, how the enclosed species behaved, what they tried, what failed. The document was called the Asterisk Compendium of Enclosed Responses, and it was 6,000 pages long, and it was comprehensive. Nowhere in its 6,000 pages was there a category for what the humans were doing. Because nowhere in those 400 years of encircling civilizations had a species responded to encirclement by getting inside the formation first. The Keth strategy assumed a specific geometry, attackers on the outside, defenders on the inside. The defenders, knowing they were surrounded, tried to break out. This was logical. This was universal. Every species in the compendium had done it, eventually in one form or another. Some fought their way out. Some tried to negotiate passage. Some collapsed inward and surrendered. But every single one had treated the boundary of the encirclement as the thing to be overcome. The humans had simply declined to be where the boundary was. Vroth spent 3 days running simulations. How had the ships gotten inside? The mathematics said it was impossible. Every gravitational lane was monitored. Every debris corridor was mapped. The Keth formation left no approach vector unobserved. He ran the simulations again. He asked his best analysts to run them independently, without sharing results. All 3 teams came back with the same answer: impossible. One of them, a young analyst named Coral, submitted a secondary document with her report. She had flagged it internally as speculative, not for formal submission, then submitted it anyway. It contained 12 pages of dense calculation and ended with a single conclusion. The ships did not enter the formation. They were already there when the formation closed around them. Vroth read it at 300 station time, alone in his command center. The display still showed the 14, now 16. 2 had apparently been logged late contacts, holding position, doing nothing. He thought about what Coral's conclusion meant. He thought about how long those ships would have needed to be in position. He thought about what that implied about how long the humans had known about the encirclement before the Keth had executed it. The Keth had spent 6 months planning the encirclement of Earth. If Coral was right, the humans had known, before it happened, and instead of trying to stop it or evacuate or surrender, they had spent those 6 months positioning ships inside the space the formation would occupy. Which meant they had wanted to be encircled. Which meant the encirclement was not what Vroth had thought it was. The question that made his primary heart rate spike and his secondary heart rate follow 4 seconds later, which his training told him was a stress response that should be logged and monitored. The question was, if this wasn't an encirclement, what was it? Samir had a habit of drawing diagrams in the condensation on cold metal walls. Yale had watched him do it 3 times now. He never explained the diagrams. He drew them, studied them for a moment, then wiped them away with his sleeve. "You're a strategist," she said on the 3rd day. "I'm a historian," he corrected. "What's the difference?" He looked at her steadily. A strategist knows how to win. A historian knows which victories turned out to be catastrophic. He wiped the diagram away. Sometimes those are the same victories. Is this one of those? He didn't answer immediately. He had a way of taking questions seriously that made her feel, each time, slightly surprised. "The Keth," he said finally, "have encircled 41 civilizations. They've done it the same way every time because it has worked every time. You know what that does to an institution? Makes them confident. Makes them blind." He tapped the metal wall where the diagram had been. "They've never once had to question whether the shape of the encirclement itself was the vulnerability. Why would they? It always works." Yale thought about that. Then she thought about the ships, 18 ships, tucked like stones in a riverbed, waiting for the river to form around them. "Samir, the ships, they're not just a signal, are they?" It wasn't a question, not really. She'd been working it through for 2 days, and she'd reached the edge of what the laminated sheet had told her, and she needed someone to say the thing that came next. Samir looked at her for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "What do you know about acoustic geometry?" She blinked. "Ship resonance. Specifically, what happens when you detonate a shaped pulse inside a closed formation of a specific configuration, at exactly the right coordinates, tuned to the structural frequency of Keth hull composites." The basement was very quiet. "You blow out the whole formation," Yale said slowly. "From the inside, you don't need to breach the encirclement, you just become the detonation." She stared at him. "The ships are positioned as an array, yes." He said it calmly, the way historians said terrible things, as a matter of record. When the synchronization window opens, assuming the grid holds, assuming the positioning is still accurate, assuming the Keth haven't moved any of their primary formation nodes. And if they have? He paused. Then 18 ships fire a pulse that does nothing meaningful, and everything that has been placed in position over the last 6 months was wasted, and the Keth maintain orbital control indefinitely, and the ground network dies slowly over the next few years as they consolidate. And if they haven't moved? He looked at the wall. Then it works. And the ships? He didn't answer right away. She waited him out. She'd gotten good at waiting. "The ships," he said, "are inside the formation. When the pulse fires, they're inside the pulse." The silence had a specific texture now. "How many crew?" she asked. "Each ship runs with a minimum crew of," he stopped, started again. "They're not unmanned." "I know. They volunteered." "I know that too." She sat with it. Outside above them, through the soil and concrete and the accumulated weight of a city that was still, somehow here, the Keth survey pulse cycled through its rotation. Methodical, confident. The pulse of something that believed it had already won. "How many people know?" she asked. "About the array. About the crew." Samir's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Enough. Executor Vroth called a command council on the 19th day. He stood at the head of the table and looked at his officers, 7 of the finest military minds in the Dominion, each of them decorated, each of them vetted, each of them staring at the same display data that had kept Vroth awake for 6 nights running. "I want assessments," he said. "Not doctrine, not the compendium. What do you actually think asterisk is happening?" There was a pause in the Keth Dominion. A direct request to deviate from formal doctrine was unusual enough that it required a moment of recalibration. Fleet Captain Oren spoke first. "They're buying time. The ships inside the formation are a distraction, psychological pressure. They know we can't fire on them without potentially disrupting our own formation integrity. They're betting we'll hesitate long enough for some kind of reinforcement to arrive from outside the system." "There is no reinforcement," Isek said flatly. "We have sensor relay at the heliopause. Nothing is coming." "Then the ships are a surrender gesture," said Tactics Officer Dem. "A formal display of hopelessness. We've seen this before. Some species perform a last symbolic resistance before capitulating." "They haven't transmitted anything," Vroth said. "No demands, no terms, no signals at all." "Fear," Dem said. "Paralysis." Vroth looked at Coral, who was the most junior person at the table and who had said nothing. "Analyst." She straightened slightly. "I think we should move the primary formation nodes." The table went quiet in a way that suggested the idea was being taken seriously, in spite of everyone's instinct to dismiss it. "Why?" Vroth said. "Because I've been running the position geometry on the internal contacts. They're not random, they're arrayed, and the array describes a—" She stopped, reconsidered her words. "It describes a shape that I don't have a technical category for, but that I can tell you is extremely precise and could not have been achieved through coincidence." She looked at Vroth directly. "They're not inside our formation by accident, and they're not inside it to fight us. They're inside it to use it." "Use it how?" "I don't know yet." "Then move the nodes," Vroth said. "Executor." Oren's voice carried the particular weight of someone about to say something unpopular. "Moving the formation nodes at this stage would require a 12-hour restructuring sequence. It would temporarily reduce our coverage of the planet's surface. The humans might use that window to—" "To what?" Vroth said. "They have 18 ships inside a formation of 460. What do you imagine they do with a 12-hour window?" Oren had no answer. "Move the nodes," Vroth said. "Begin the sequence in 2 hours." He didn't know, as he said it, that he was already 17 hours too late. The message came through copper pipe. 3 taps very fast, then a long pause, then 5 slow taps. Yale had the pipe pressed against her ear before the last one finished. 5 slow taps wasn't a code she'd been taught formally. It was the kind of signal you created in the field when formal code stopped being sufficient for the situation. She'd been taught what it meant by someone who was apparently now one of the 18. 5 slow taps, don't wait for confirmation, it's already done. She sat up sharply. Samir. He was across the room, asleep against the wall in the way that soldiers and historians apparently slept the same way, upright, with one hand near something useful. He opened his eyes. "Message," she said. "They moved it up." He was on his feet before she finished. "How early?" "Don't know, it just says it's done." "The window was supposed to be—" He stopped. Did math she couldn't follow. If they moved it up, it means the Keth formation nodes are shifting. They must have noticed something. He looked at the ceiling as though he could see through it. If the nodes are shifting, the geometry of the array changes. The pulse won't propagate the same way. Will it still work? He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something in his face that wasn't careful historical distance. "I don't know," he said. The pulse hit at 6:14 station time. Vroth felt it before the instruments registered it, a resonance that passed through the Undying Throne's asterisk hull from bow to stern, A single note played on a frequency that shouldn't have been able to propagate through vacuum. It lasted 1.3 seconds. Then the displays lit up simultaneously across every station, and the tactical channel filled with voices, and Vroth stood at the center of it and made himself be still. The formation nodes that had already begun their repositioning took the pulse asymmetrically. Of the 461 ships in the Keth encirclement, 217 experienced full resonance cascade. Their hulls, tuned to a specific composite frequency that Keth engineers had used for 90 years without ever imagining it as a vulnerability, responded to the pulse like strings to a bow. They didn't explode. They sang, a fraction of a second of precise resonance that collapsed every major structural joint simultaneously. 217 ships came apart in the silence of space, and Vroth watched it happen on his display in the 4 seconds it took for the cascade to complete, and he could not move, because what he was seeing was not the outcome of a battle. It was the outcome of an experiment that had been running for 6 months, and he had been one of the test subjects. Executor Issek's voice was very controlled. The internal contacts. Gone, he said. He knew without looking. They're gone. All 18 are, yes. They fired from inside the array. The pulse propagated outward. He looked at the display. The encirclement had a shape like a jaw with half its teeth knocked out. The surviving ships, 244 of them, were already reforming, already tightening around the planet below, already filling gaps. The Dominion didn't break because of one blow. That was the whole point of a Dominion. But the planet was still there. The humans were still there. And in the debris field where 217 Keth warships had become 17 minutes of drifting metal, there were 18 human ships that were no longer anything at all. Vroth thought about Coral's report. The ships did not enter the formation. They were already there when the formation closed around them. He thought about what that meant. They had positioned those ships with those crews, before the encirclement was complete, in the knowledge that the encirclement would close around them, in the knowledge that there would be no extracting them afterward, in the knowledge that when the synchronization window opened, they would be inside the pulse they fired. They had volunteered to be the detonator. He thought about the compendium, 6,000 pages, 400 years, 41 civilizations. Not one of them had done this. "Get me a communications channel," he said. Issek looked up. To who? "The planet." Silence. "Executor, our doctrine in encirclement situations does not." "I'm not asking about doctrine." He looked at the display one more time, at the neat geometric spacing of the human ships that had been hidden in his formation like seeds, like a key waiting for the lock to finish assembling itself around it. "I'm asking for a channel." She opened it. He stood at his display and thought about what to say to a species that had beaten him with patience and precision and the willingness to spend lives as instruments rather than stakes. Not recklessly. That was the thing that kept catching in his mind, the thing he couldn't resolve into any framework he possessed. Not recklessly. Carefully. Deliberately. With months of preparation and total operational security, and the kind of sacrifice that was only possible if the people doing it fully understood what they were agreeing to. He had believed, the compendium said, that encircled species fought from desperation. He understood now that desperation and intention could wear the same face and mean entirely different things. "This is Executor Vroth of the Keth Dominion vessel Undying Throne." He paused. "I am requesting terms of negotiation." The channel was quiet for 11 seconds. He counted them. Then a voice came back, slightly distorted by the distance, steady in a way that made him think of the pressure pulse he'd heard in his teeth every 12 minutes for 19 days. "We were wondering when you'd call," the voice said. It was female. It sounded tired and utterly unsurprised and not at all afraid. "We've had someone standing by." Yale found out the call had gone through the same way she found out everything else in those days, through copper pipe, in the dark, in a language she'd spent 4 months learning. 3 taps, 1 tap, 3 taps. They're talking. She pressed her forehead against the cold metal of the pipe and allowed herself, for the first time in 19 days, to breathe all the way out. Samir was watching her from across the room. She didn't speak. She just nodded once. He nodded back in the way that historians nodded when the record moved in a direction that was survivable rather than merely notable. She thought about 18 ships. She thought about the crews. She thought about the word volunteered and the weight it carried, and what it meant that those 18 ships and those crews had bought this. Not a victory, not a peace, not an end, but a conversation. The Keth were still out there. 244 ships still in the dark above them. The encirclement was wounded but not gone. But they were talking. She thought about what Samir had said. A strategist knows how to win. A historian knows which victories turn out to be catastrophic. She thought about which one this was going to be. She thought about the 18 and decided that whatever this became, peace or standoff or the first phase of something longer and stranger, those 18 had made it asterisk something rather than nothing, and nothing was what they'd been looking at on day 17. "What do you think they're saying?" she asked. Samir considered. The Keth commander, he's probably trying to understand what just happened. He's going to want to know how we knew, how we got the ships in place, how long we'd been planning it. And our negotiator is going to tell him. Our negotiator is going to tell him exactly as much as makes him willing to stop firing and start thinking. A pause, which is the whole art of this kind of conversation. Yale was quiet for a moment. Then, he must be, I don't know, what's the Keth version of afraid? Samir made a sound that in another context might have been a laugh. Apparently, they have 2 heart rates, the primary and the secondary. The secondary follows the primary by 4 seconds under normal conditions. Under stress, the gap narrows. How do you know that? I've read a lot of post-contact physiological reports. She thought about an alien commander standing at his display, watching 400 years of unbroken doctrine crack open from the inside, his 2 hearts beating close together in the dark. She thought about what it meant to him, what it changed. Not that humans were strong. The 18 ships were proof they weren't strong, not in the way the Keth measured strength, not in tonnage and formation density and firepower. But strength wasn't the point. The Keth had understood the battle in terms of strength, had shaped their entire strategy around the equation of overwhelming force against limited resistance, and that was exactly why they'd lost it. You can't encircle something that decided long ago that it didn't need to be outside the circle. Vroth received the historian's name 3 days into negotiations. Samir al-Rashid. He requested, quietly, through a back channel his communications officer wasn't entirely sure was authorized, a biographical profile. He read it at 200 station time, in his command center, with the display still showing the debris field that had been 217 ships. Al-Rashid was not a soldier. He was not a politician. He held a chair in military history at a university in a city called Cairo, which was in a region called Egypt, which had one of the longest continuous histories of any civilization on the planet below. He had published a book called The Architecture of Inevitable Victories, which Vroth had translated, and which was about the way institutions defeated themselves by succeeding too completely. Vroth held the translation in his hands and read the opening line 3 times. The most dangerous moment in any institution's history is not when it fails. It is when it has succeeded so thoroughly, for so long, that it has forgotten how to imagine its own failure. He thought about the compendium, 6,000 pages, 400 years. He thought about 18 ships, positioned with the patience of someone who had read very carefully about how the Keth executed encirclements, and who had used that reading the way you used a map, not to go where the map showed, but to understand where the map's edges were. He thought about what it meant that a species had sent a historian to win a war. He set the translation down. He looked at the planet below, still turning, still lit from its star, still there. He thought about the Dominion's response when news of this reached the inner systems. He thought about the formal inquiry that was coming, and the review of the encirclement doctrine that was coming, and the political consequences that were coming. He thought about Coral, who had seen it and said move the nodes, and who had been 2 hours too late in being listened to, which was also in the book. He realized, the book he was only now reading after the damage was done. He requested a direct channel. When Al-Rashid answered, there was the same background quality that Vroth had noticed in every transmission from the planet. A faint reverberation that suggested underground spaces, enclosed rooms, people who had been holding very still for a very long time. "I read your book," Vroth said. A pause. "Which one?" "The only one that matters, apparently." Another pause longer. "You read fast." "I had motivation." He heard something that might have been from a human, a sound of wry acknowledgement. The translator rendered it as *recognized irony. He took that on faith. "You knew," Vroth said. "Before we moved a single ship into position, you knew we were coming." "We assessed it as likely, yes." "And you spent 6 months positioning those ships." "Yes." "The crews," he stopped. He wasn't sure why he stopped. They understood what the synchronization window meant for them. They did. The channel was quiet. "Why?" Vroth said. It wasn't really a tactical question. He knew the tactical answer. He meant something underneath it, something the compendium had never addressed because it had never needed to. Al-Rashid answered him, and the answer was not what he expected, because it wasn't about Earth, or the encirclement, or the war, or even the 18. "Because," Al-Rashid said, "we've been doing this to each other since long before you arrived, dying for something that continues after us. It's not special. It's just what we do when we run out of better options." A pause. "We just try very hard to make sure it counts." Vroth sat with that for a long time. He thought about all the civilizations in the compendium. 41 species, 6,000 pages, 400 years. He thought about how every single one of them had tried to escape the encirclement. Break the line. Get back outside. He thought about a species that had looked at the encirclement coming and decided, with months of precise and careful preparation and willing sacrifice, not to escape it, to use it. He thought about what it meant to be an empire that had surrounded a planet, with 400 years of flawless doctrine, and to find out too late, at the cost of 217 ships, at the cost of whatever came next, that the planet had been waiting for you to finish. He thought about what kind of species did that. He thought about the historian underground, in a flooded basement, reading copper pipe in the dark. He thought, we are not going to be able to hold this encirclement. Not because the humans were stronger. They weren't. Not because they had better technology. They didn't. Not because the remaining 244 ships of the Dominion fleet couldn't maintain orbital control indefinitely. They could. But because the humans had already done this once with 6 months and 18 volunteers, and a university professor who had read the right books, they would do it again, and again, each time in a way that had no category in the compendium. Each time at a cost that rational calculation said no species should be willing to pay, and which humans paid anyway, not from desperation, but from the specific, terrible, patient certainty that something would continue after them, and that continuing was worth it. The Keth Dominion had defeated stronger fleets. They had encircled smarter civilizations. They had outlasted longer wars. They had never encountered a species for whom losing was simply one more thing that happened on the way to not losing. Vroth opened the channel to the Dominion's inner systems. He began to compose the message that would end his career and change, in ways he couldn't yet fully predict, the shape of the next 400 years. He reported, in precise and unembellished terms, what had happened. He recommended, in equally precise terms, that the encirclement be dissolved. He attached Coral's report. He attached Al-Rashid's book. He added at the end a single line that was not standard Dominion report format, and that the review board would later note with something the translator described as asterisk institutional discomfort. Asterisk. We surrounded them completely. They were already on the inside. I do not believe there is a version of this encirclement that ends well for us. Because I do not believe the encirclement was ever ours to end. It was theirs to finish. We simply provided the shape. He scented. He stood at his display. Below him, Earth turned in the dark, unhurried, lit from its star, the way it had been turning for 4.5 billion years through extinctions and recoveries, and the specific, stubborn insistence on continuance that apparently did not stop being true just because someone surrounded it from space. Vroth had studied 41 encirclements. He understood now what made this one different. It wasn't the ships. It wasn't the pulse. It wasn't even the 18, though they were the part that would stay with him in the specific way that certain things stayed, lodged in the bone rather than the memory. It was that the humans had never once tried to get outside the circle. They had waited inside it, patient and precise and willing, until the circle became theirs. The Keth Dominion was the strongest military force in this region of the galaxy. They had never lost an encirclement in 400 years. They had lost this one, Vroth understood finally, not on the 19th day when the pulse fired, and not on the day the ships were positioned, and not even on the day the Keth had first decided to come. They had lost it the day they assumed that surrounding something meant you controlled what was inside.